Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly special, the world's most soul-crushingly boring jobs in history. The forgotten occupations that made civilization possible while simultaneously destroying the human spirit, one tedious day at a time. These weren't just bad jobs. These were positions that made watching paint dry look like extreme sports. So before we begin this journey through history's most mind-numbing careers, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy diving into the darker, more tedious corners of human experience. And let me know in the comments what the most boring job you've ever had was. I guarantee it wasn't as bad as what we're about to explore. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab a drink, because we're about to meet the ancient Egyptian tomb watchers who stared at stone doors for months, the medieval leech collectors who waded through disease-infested swamps, and the Roman wine testers who slowly poisoned themselves one sip at a time. So you think your job is boring? Adorable. Truly, like complaining about a paper cut while standing next to someone who just lost a limb. Let's see how you feel after hearing about these poor souls who spent their entire lives performing tasks so repetitive and mind-numbing that they make data entry look like a thrilling adventure. Picture this: you wake up every morning knowing that your job is so mind-numbingly tedious that death might actually be a promotion. Welcome to the world's most boring jobs in history, where excitement went to die and enthusiasm was buried in an unmarked grave. These weren't just bad jobs. These were soul-crushing, will-to-live destroying. Why did I even being born? Occupations that made watching paint dry look like extreme sports. Let's start with the ancient Egyptian tomb door sealers. Yes, that was a real job. Someone had to sit outside freshly sealed tombs for weeks, sometimes months, making sure nobody broke in to steal the pharaoh's golden toilet seat or whatever priceless artifacts were buried inside. Your entire day consisted of staring at a stone door. That's it. Just you, a rock, and the crushing weight of existential dread. No Netflix, no smartphones, no books. Just you and your thoughts, which after day 3 probably consisted entirely of wondering if the afterlife had better career opportunities. The pay: a handful of grain and the privilege of not being fed to crocodiles. The benefits: well, you got to work outdoors. If you consider sitting in the desert sun for 12 hours while slowly losing your sanity a perk. And the advancement opportunities: congratulations, if you did this job well enough for long enough, you might get promoted to watching a slightly more important tomb. Same job, marginally better corpse. But wait, it gets worse. These tomb watchers had to stay alert because tomb robbers were everywhere, and they were creative. They'd dig tunnels, dress up as priests, or simply wait for you to fall asleep from sheer boredom before making their move. So not only was your job mind-numbingly dull, but failure meant you'd probably end up as mummy wrapping yourself. The ancient Egyptians didn't believe in second chances, especially when their eternal resting places were involved. Now let's talk about medieval arrow straighteners. Yes, in a world where your life often depended on the accuracy of your weaponry, someone had the thrilling job of making sure arrows flew straight. Picture this: you spend your entire day examining wooden sticks, rolling them on flat surfaces, and using primitive tools to remove tiny imperfections. Each arrow had to be perfectly straight, perfectly balanced, and perfectly boring to manufacture. The process was excruciating. First, you'd select a piece of wood, usually birch or ash, then spend hours shaving it down to the perfect diameter. Too thick and it won't fly properly. Too thin and it'll snap on impact. Then came the real fun-size straightening. You'd heat the wood over a fire, bend it incrementally, check it against a straight edge, heat it again, bend it again, check again. This could take hours per arrow, and a decent archer might go through dozens of arrows in a single battle. But here's the kicker. Nobody cared about your craftsmanship until something went wrong. Make 1,000 perfect arrows. Silence. Make one crooked arrow that causes a knight to miss his target and die horribly. Suddenly everyone's an expert on arrow dynamics. And since most arrow straighteners were peasants working for feudal lords, job security was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. One bad batch, and you might find yourself testing the product from the wrong end. The working conditions were spectacular too. You'd crouch over your work in poorly lit workshops, breathing in wood shavings and smoke from the fire. Your back would ache, your eyes would strain. and your social life would consist entirely of other craftsmen who were just as thrilled with their repetitive lives as you were. The pinnacle of excitement might be when someone brought you a particularly warped piece of wood that required an extra hour of tedious adjustment. Then there were the Roman public scribes, the human copy machines of the ancient world. Before printing presses, if you wanted multiple copies of a document, you needed an army of scribes to write them out by hand. These weren't the prestigious scribes who worked for senators or emperors, copying important laws and historical documents. No, these were the bottom-tier scribes who copied shopping lists, tax records, and inventory reports. Imagine spending your entire day copying lists of grain quantities or olive oil distributions. Marcus owes 3 amphorae of wine. Gaius has delivered 12 bushels of wheat. Lucius requires 15 feet of rope for his donkey. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Your hand would cramp, your eyes would water, and your soul would gradually die as you transcribed the mundane details of Roman bureaucracy. The worst part, you had to be absolutely perfect. One mistake in a tax record, and suddenly the empire thought someone owed 17 goats instead of 7, which could lead to anything from angry taxpayers to international incidents involving livestock. So you couldn't even let your mind wander to more interesting thoughts. Every letter had to be precise, every number accurate, every word spelled correctly in a language that seemed designed to make your life more difficult. And the social status, you were barely above slaves, performing work that was essential but completely invisible. Nobody celebrated the scribe who accurately recorded the city's fish market transactions. There were no parades for the guy who flawlessly copied municipal water usage reports. You were a human quill pen, replaceable and forgettable, spending your days drowning in other people's paperwork. Speaking of drowning, let's dive into the wonderful world of medieval moat maintainers. These dedicated individuals had the delightful task of keeping castle moats in proper working order. What does that mean exactly? Well, moats weren't just decorative water features. They were defensive installations that needed to be kept at the right depth, free of debris, and sufficiently disgusting to discourage enemy swimmers. Your day would start by wading into water that was part sewer, part garbage disposal, and part marine cemetery. Dead animals, human waste, rotting food, broken weapons, and whatever else the castle inhabitants decided to toss over the walls all ended up in your workplace. Armed with nothing but basic tools and a complete absence of waterproof clothing, you'd spend hours cleaning out decomposing matter, while trying not to think about what you were standing in. But the real challenge was maintenance. Moats had to be deep enough to prevent enemies from simply walking across, but not so deep that they became stagnant breeding grounds for disease. This meant constantly monitoring water levels, clearing drainage systems, and occasionally dredging the bottom to remove accumulated muck, all while wearing medieval clothing that became approximately as comfortable as wearing a wet wool tent once it got soaked. The health benefits of this job were extraordinary. If by extraordinary you mean you had an excellent chance of contracting any number of medieval diseases that hadn't even been named yet. Dysentery, cholera, plague, and various parasitic infections were all occupational hazards. Plus, you smelled so bad that even other peasants avoided you, which really limited your social opportunities in an era when social opportunities were already somewhat restricted. And let's not forget the job security. If the castle was attacked and the moat didn't work properly, guess who got blamed? Not the lord who decided to build his fortress in a swamp, and certainly not the architect who designed a moat system that defied basic principles of hydraulics. No, it was clearly the moat maintainer's fault for not making the water scary enough, or deep enough, or green enough, or whatever the specific complaint happened to be. Now, let's journey to ancient China and meet the professional bamboo splitter. In a civilization that used bamboo for everything from houses to underwear, someone had to split the bamboo poles into usable pieces. This sounds simple until you realize that bamboo splitting is both an art and a form of meditation. Assuming your idea of meditation involves repetitive motions that could easily result in slicing off your fingers. The process required incredible precision. Too thick and the bamboo wouldn't be flexible enough for its intended use. Too thin and it would snap under pressure. The splitter would use a sharp knife to make initial cuts, then carefully work the bamboo apart along its natural grain lines. This took hours per pole, and a single house might require hundreds of poles in various thicknesses. But here's what made it truly mind-numbing: bamboo doesn't grow uniformly. Each pole was different, requiring you to assess the grain, determine the optimal splitting pattern, and adjust your technique accordingly. You couldn't just go on autopilot and split away, because bamboo has a malicious sense of humor and will punish inattentiveness by splitting in completely unexpected directions, usually toward your face. The working environment was about as exciting as you'd expect. You'd sit in the same position for hours, surrounded by bamboo shavings that got into everything, including your lungs, your food, and places you'd rather not think about. The dust made you cough, the repetitive motion made your joints ache, and the constant focus required to avoid injury made your head throb. Plus, bamboo splinters are particularly nasty, so even small mistakes could leave you picking tiny pieces of wood out of your skin for days. Career advancement in bamboo splitting was essentially non-existent. You were either good at it or you weren't, and if you weren't, you'd quickly find yourself looking for other work after too many ruined poles and injured fingers. If you were good at it, congratulations, you'd found your calling, and you could look forward to decades of sitting in the same spot, making the same motions, splitting the same material, while slowly losing the ability to hold a conversation about anything other than bamboo grain patterns. Let's shift gears and visit ancient Rome again, this time to meet the professional wine testers. Wait, that sounds good, right? Wrong. These weren't sophisticated sommeliers swirling vintage wines and making notes about subtle flavor profiles. These were quality control inspectors whose job was to make sure the wine wasn't poisonous before it reached important people. Wine poisoning was a real concern in ancient Rome, both accidental and intentional. Accidental because wine-making techniques weren't exactly standardized, and you might end up with a batch that could kill you through either toxicity or sheer awful taste. Intentional because poisoning people through their wine was a popular assassination technique, and wealthy Romans were understandably paranoid about what they drank. So the wine tester's job was to sample every single jug, amphora, or barrel before it was served to anyone important. This sounds like it might be fun until you realize several crucial facts. First, you're basically a human canary, and your primary value lies in your ability to detect poison by not dying after drinking it. Second, you're sampling wine all day long without the benefit of modern knowledge about alcohol tolerance or liver health. Third, most Roman wine was about as subtle as a brick to the face and roughly twice as acidic. Your typical day would involve systematically working through dozens of different wines, taking careful notes about taste, smell, and whether or not you felt like you were dying afterward. The wine was often mixed with water, herbs, honey, or other additives, which meant you weren't just testing pure wine, but rather a constantly changing array of concoctions that ranged from merely unpalatable to potentially lethal. The occupational hazards were significant. Chronic alcohol poisoning was an obvious risk, but so was actual poisoning from tainted wine. Plus, your palate would become so damaged from constant exposure to harsh, acidic wines that you'd gradually lose the ability to taste anything subtle, which somewhat defeated the purpose of having a professional taster in the first place. And if you missed a poisoned batch, well, let's just say that Roman employers weren't known for their understanding when it came to work-related failures. Now let's travel to medieval Europe and meet the professional leech collectors. Before modern medicine, leeches were used for bloodletting, which doctors believed could cure everything from headaches to the plague. This created a demand for leeches, and where there's demand, there's someone willing to wade into swamp water to supply it. Leech collection was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. You'd wade into stagnant ponds, marshes, and slow-moving streams, often up to your waist in murky water that smelled like a combination of rotten eggs and death. The leeches would attach themselves to your legs and arms, and you'd have to carefully remove them and place them in containers while trying not to damage them. Damaged leeches were worthless leeches, and worthless leeches meant no pay. The technique required surprising skill. You had to know where leeches liked to congregate, what time of day they were most active, and how to remove them without causing them to regurgitate their previous meal all over your collection containers. You also had to distinguish between different types of leeches because not all leeches were suitable for medical use. Some were too large, some too small, and some carried diseases that made them unsuitable for therapeutic bloodletting. But the real challenge was dealing with the other wildlife that shared leech habitats. Snakes, disease-carrying insects, parasitic worms, and various forms of bacteria all called these places home. You'd emerge from each collecting expedition covered in bites, scratches, and Lord knows what else, carrying containers of slimy creatures that would spend the next several days trying to escape and attach themselves to anything warm, blooded they could find. The seasonal nature of the work made it even worse. Leeches were most active during warm months, which meant you'd be wading through swamps during the time of year when those swamps were at their most pestilent and disease-ridden. Winter brought relief from leeches but also unemployment, since frozen leeches weren't much good for medical purposes. Let's venture into ancient Egypt again, this time to meet the professional mummy unwrapper. Wait, that sounds interesting, right? Like archaeology. No, these weren't scholars carefully studying ancient burial practices. These were laborers whose job was to unwrap mummies quickly and efficiently to harvest valuable materials like linen wrappings and whatever jewelry might be hidden inside. The process was absolutely revolting. Mummies weren't just dried out bodies. They were bodies that had been preserved using various chemicals and then wrapped in layers upon layers of resin-soaked linen. After centuries in tombs, these wrappings had often fused with the body, creating a partially mummified, partially decomposed mess that had to be carefully separated without damaging anything valuable. You'd work in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in dust from ancient linen wrappings, particles of desiccated human remains, and whatever chemicals the ancient embalmers had used. The smell was indescribable, a combination of old death, chemical preservatives, and whatever had been living in the tomb for the past few centuries. Your hands would be constantly covered in sticky, ancient resins that seemed impossible to wash off. The work required tedious precision. You had to unwrap layer after layer of ancient bandages, checking each one for hidden jewelry or amulets while being careful not to damage the wrappings themselves, which could be cleaned and reused. This meant hours of delicate work on each mummy, breathing in progressively more awful air as you got deeper into the wrappings and closer to whatever remained of the actual body. And the psychological toll was considerable. You were literally taking apart human beings who had been buried with the expectation that they'd remain intact for eternity. Whether or not you believed in ancient Egyptian religious practices, there was something deeply unsettling about making a living by undoing other people's final resting arrangements. Plus, you never knew what you might find inside the wrappings, and sometimes what you found was considerably more disturbing than what you'd expected. Now let's journey to medieval monasteries and meet the illuminated manuscript preparers. These weren't the skilled artists who created beautiful illustrations and ornate lettering. These were the support staff who prepared the materials the artists used. Specifically, they prepared vellum, which was writing material made from animal skins. The process of turning animal hide into vellum was lengthy, disgusting, and required the patience of a saint, which was probably why it was often done in monasteries. First, you'd start with fresh animal skins, usually from calves, sheep, or goats. These had to be cleaned, which meant scraping off any remaining flesh fat or hair using sharp knives. This was messy, smelly work that left you covered in animal debris and whatever else had been living on the hide. Next came the soaking process. The skins would be soaked in lime water for days or weeks to help remove any remaining organic material and prepare them for stretching. You'd have to regularly check on the soaking skins, turning them and replacing the lime water as needed. Lime water has a distinctive, unpleasant odor and will burn your skin if you're not careful, so this part of the job came with its own special set of health hazards. After soaking, the skins had to be stretched on wooden frames and scraped repeatedly to achieve the right thickness and smoothness. This was back-breaking work that required hours of repetitive scraping motions, often in cold, damp monastery workshops. The scraping had to be done carefully, because too much pressure would create holes, while too little pressure would leave the vellum too thick or rough for writing. The final steps involved more scraping, sanding with abrasive stones, and treating the surface with various substances to make it suitable for ink. A single piece of vellum might require weeks of work, and a complete illuminated manuscript could require dozens of pieces. Meanwhile, you'd spend your days surrounded by the smell of animal skins, lime, and various chemicals, performing repetitive motions that left your hands cramped and your back aching. Let's travel to ancient China and visit the professional silkworm sorter. In a culture that treated silk like liquid gold, someone had to sort through thousands of silkworm cocoons to determine which ones were suitable for different grades of silk production. This was precision work that required excellent eyesight, infinite patience, and the ability to handle thousands of tiny, identical-looking objects without losing your mind. The sorting process was incredibly detailed. Each cocoon had to be examined for size, shape, color, and quality. The very best cocoons would be used for the finest silk, while progressively lower quality cocoons would be designated for different grades of material. The rejects would be used for silk waste, which was still valuable but much less so than premium silk. You'd sit in the same position for hours, picking up cocoon after cocoon, turning it over in your hands, examining it from every angle, and placing it in the appropriate sorting bin. Your eyes would strain from the close work, your fingers would become numb from handling thousands of small objects, and your mind would slowly slip away as you perform the same examination sequence thousands of times per day. But the real challenge was accuracy. A single misgraded cocoon could affect the quality of an entire batch of silk, which could impact trade relationships, diplomatic gifts, or imperial garments. The consequences of mistakes were severe, ranging from financial penalties to much more serious punishments, depending on who was affected by your error. The seasonal nature of silk production made the job even more intense. When cocoons were ready, they were all ready at once, which meant weeks of extremely long days, sorting through enormous quantities of cocoons before they deteriorated. There was no pacing yourself or taking breaks. The cocoons wouldn't wait, and neither would your supervisors. Now let's visit ancient Rome once more and meet the professional gladiator equipment maintainer. These weren't the glamorous fighters who battled in the arena. These were the support staff who kept the weapons and armor in fighting condition. This meant cleaning blood and gore off equipment after each fight, repairing damage, and ensuring that everything was properly maintained. After each gladiatorial contest, you'd collect weapons and armor that were covered in blood, sweat, sand, and various other bodily fluids. This equipment had to be thoroughly cleaned, not just for hygiene, but because blood and other organic materials would cause metal to corrode if left untreated. You'd spend hours scrubbing away biological matter, using abrasive materials and whatever cleaning agents were available. The repair work was equally tedious. Swords had to be sharpened, armor had to be hammered back into shape, and straps had to be replaced. Much of this work required skilled craftsmanship, but the repetitive nature of it meant that even skilled work became mind-numbing after thousands of repairs. Plus, you were constantly reminded that the damage you were fixing had been inflicted on human beings, often fatally. The working conditions were less than ideal. You'd work in shops located near the amphitheaters, which meant you were surrounded by the sounds, smells, and general atmosphere of violent entertainment. The noise from the crowds was constant during events, and the smell of blood and death permeated everything. Your workspace would be filled with weapons, specifically designed to kill people, and your job was to make sure they remained as lethal as possible. The social stigma was also significant. While gladiators themselves achieved a certain celebrity status, the support staff were associated with all the negative aspects of the games without any of the glory. You were part of the killing machine, but without any of the respect or admiration that successful gladiators received. Let's travel to medieval Europe and meet the professional bell ringer apprentice. This wasn't the main bell ringer, who at least had some authority and respect. This was the apprentice whose job was to learn the craft by performing the most repetitive and boring aspects of bell ringing for years before being trusted with anything important. Your primary responsibility was practicing basic bell sequences for hours every day. This meant pulling ropes in specific patterns to create different combinations of chimes. The sequences had to be memorized perfectly, because even small mistakes during religious services or civic announcements could cause significant problems. So you'd spend entire days pulling the same ropes in the same patterns, over and over, until the motions became automatic. But bell ringing is physically demanding work. The bells were heavy, the ropes were rough, and the pulling motions required significant upper body strength. Your hands would develop calluses and rope burns. Your shoulders and arms would ache constantly, and the repetitive motions would cause joint problems over time. Plus, you'd be working in bell towers, which were typically cold, drafty, and filled with the deafening sound of massive bronze bells. The learning process was incredibly slow. Bell ringing traditions were passed down through generations, and each sequence had historical and religious significance that had to be understood as well as memorized. You couldn't just learn the physical motions, you had to understand why each sequence was used, when it was appropriate, and how it fit into the broader context of community life. Meanwhile, you'd spend years as the lowest ranking member of the bell ringing team, which meant you got all the worst tasks. Cleaning the bell tower, maintaining the ropes, polishing the bells, and handling any dirty work that needed to be done. The actual bell ringing was almost a relief compared to scrubbing bird droppings off massive bronze bells while perched on rickety wooden platforms high above the ground. Now let's journey to ancient Egypt one more time and meet the professional pyramid block inspector. During the construction of the Great Pyramids, someone had to examine each individual stone block to ensure it met the exacting standards required for such massive construction projects. This was you, armed with measuring tools and an eye for imperfections, spending your days looking at rocks. Each block had to be examined for size, shape, surface quality, and structural integrity. The tolerance for error was extremely small because even tiny imperfections could cause problems when multiplied across thousands of blocks in a structure that needed to last for eternity. You'd use primitive measuring devices to check dimensions, run your hands over surfaces to detect flaws, and test each block's weight and balance. The work was physically demanding in multiple ways. The blocks were huge and heavy, so examining them required climbing on, around, and under massive pieces of stone. The construction sites were hot, dusty, and filled with the noise and chaos of thousands of workers. You'd spend your days covered in stone dust, squinting in bright sunlight, and breathing air that was thick with particles of limestone and granite. But the mental demands were equally challenging. Each block had to meet precise specifications, but the specifications themselves were complex and varied depending on where the block would be used in the pyramid. Blocks for the base had different requirements than blocks for the middle sections, which had different requirements than blocks for the upper levels. You had to remember all these variations and apply them correctly to thousands of different blocks. The pressure was enormous because mistakes were essentially permanent. Once a flawed block was incorporated into the pyramid structure, removing it could be impossible without damaging surrounding blocks. This meant that every decision you made about accepting or rejecting a block could affect the entire project. The consequences of errors weren't just professional, they were religious and political, since the pyramids were sacred structures that represented the pharaoh's eternal power. Let's shift to medieval Europe and meet the professional salt mine candle maintainer. Salt mines were dark, dangerous places where the only lighting came from candles and torches. Someone had to maintain these light sources to ensure that miners could see what they were doing and avoid the numerous hazards that filled underground salt extraction sites. Your job was to move through the mine tunnels carrying replacement candles, checking on existing light sources, and ensuring that no area was left in darkness. This sounds simple until you consider the working environment. Salt mines are humid, which makes candles burn poorly and go out frequently. The air is often filled with salt particles that interfere with combustion. The tunnels are narrow, uneven, and filled with obstacles that can knock over candles or cause them to fall. You'd spend your days crawling through cramped tunnels, often on your hands and knees, carrying bags of candles and basic maintenance tools. The constant humidity would soak through your clothes, the salt would irritate your skin and eyes, and the poor air quality would leave you constantly coughing. Plus, you'd be working in near total darkness most of the time, navigating by feel and the dim light of whatever candles were still burning. The safety aspects were terrifying. Salt mines were prone to cave-ins, flooding, and toxic gas accumulation. Your candles were often the only warning system miners had for dangerous gas levels. If candles started going out for no apparent reason, it might mean toxic or explosive gases were present. This made your job not just boring but potentially life-saving for other workers, which added pressure to get everything right. But the most mind-numbing aspect was the repetitive nature of the work. You'd follow the same routes through the mine, checking the same locations, replacing the same candles, dealing with the same problems day after day. The underground environment meant you had no sense of time passing, no weather changes, no natural light to break up the monotony, just endless hours in dark, damp tunnels, tending to tiny flames that represented the only barrier between the miners and complete darkness. Now let's visit ancient Greece and meet the professional olive oil quality controller. Olive oil was crucial to Greek civilization, used for cooking, lighting, religious ceremonies, and personal hygiene. Someone had to test each batch of oil to ensure it met quality standards and wasn't contaminated or spoiled. The testing process involved examining the oil's color, smell, taste, and consistency. You'd pour small samples into testing vessels, hold them up to the light to check for clarity and color variations, smell them for signs of rancidity or contamination, and taste them to assess flavor and quality. This sounds pleasant until you realize you'd be doing this for dozens or hundreds of samples per day. Your palate would become damaged from constantly tasting oils of varying quality, some of which were spoiled, contaminated, or simply awful. The constant exposure to oil would leave your hands and clothes permanently greasy, and the smell of olive oil would permeate everything you owned. Plus, bad olive oil can cause stomach problems, so you'd regularly experience nausea, indigestion, and other digestive issues as occupational hazards. The pressure for accuracy was significant, because olive oil was valuable and mistakes were expensive. Approving a batch of spoiled oil could cause financial losses and damage trade relationships. Rejecting a good batch was equally problematic because it meant wasted resources and unhappy suppliers. You had to make these decisions quickly and correctly, often while dealing with suppliers who had strong opinions about your assessments. The seasonal nature of olive oil production made the job even more intense. When olives were harvested and pressed, enormous quantities of oil would need to be tested quickly before it spoiled. This meant working extremely long hours during harvest season, tasting hundreds of oil samples per day while trying to maintain the sensitivity and accuracy needed to distinguish between subtle quality differences. Let's travel to medieval monasteries again and meet the professional manuscript page counter. Before printing presses, books were extremely valuable, and monasteries needed to keep precise records of how many pages were in each manuscript for inventory and valuation purposes. This was your job, counting pages over and over to ensure accurate records. The process sounds simple, but was actually quite complex. Pages weren't always uniform in size or clearly numbered. Manuscripts were often damaged or incomplete, and you had to distinguish between different types of pages: blank pages, partial pages, and pages that had been removed or added. Each manuscript required careful examination and precise counting, often multiple times to ensure accuracy. You'd work in cold, dimly lit scriptoriums, hunched over ancient books for hours at a time. The manuscripts were delicate and valuable, so you had to handle them carefully while still being thorough in your examination. Your eyes would strain from the poor lighting and small text. Your back would ache from bending over books, and your mind would go numb from the repetitive counting. The record-keeping requirements were extensive. You didn't just count pages. You had to record detailed information about each manuscript's condition, contents, and physical characteristics. This information had to be written in precise Latin, using specific formatting conventions, and mistakes could invalidate entire inventory records. The psychological toll was significant, because you were surrounded by knowledge and learning, but weren't actually learning anything yourself. You'd handle manuscripts containing philosophy, theology, literature, and science, but your job was simply to count their pages rather than read or understand their contents. It was like being a librarian who was forbidden from reading books. Finally, let's visit ancient China one last time and meet the professional rice grain inspector. In a civilization where rice was the foundation of the economy and millions of people's survival, someone had to examine rice crops to ensure quality and determine appropriate storage and distribution methods. Your job was to examine individual rice grains, sorting them by size, quality, and condition. This required incredible attention to detail because rice quality affected everything from tax assessments to famine prevention. You'd use small tools to examine grains for insect damage, mold, discoloration, and other defects that could indicate storage problems or crop diseases. The work was incredibly tedious. You'd sit in the same position for hours, picking up individual grains of rice, examining them closely, and sorting them into different categories. Your eyes would strain from the close work, your fingers would become stiff from handling thousands of tiny objects, and your mind would gradually slip away as you performed the same examination sequence countless times. But the pressure was enormous because your assessments affected food distribution decisions that could impact thousands of people. Misgrading rice quality could lead to inappropriate storage methods that allowed crops to spoil, or incorrect distribution decisions that left some areas with inadequate food supplies. The consequences of mistakes weren't just professional, they could be matters of life and death for entire communities. The seasonal demands were intense, because rice harvesting created enormous quantities of grain that needed to be processed quickly. You'd work extremely long hours during harvest periods, examining thousands of rice grains per day, while maintaining the accuracy and attention to detail required to make decisions that affected food security for entire regions. These jobs shared common characteristics that made them uniquely soul-crushing. They required precision and attention to detail, but were repetitive enough to numb the mind. They were essential to their societies, but completely invisible and unappreciated. They offered no opportunities for creativity, advancement, or personal satisfaction. And they were performed by people who had little choice in the matter, often because economic circumstances left them few alternatives. The workers who performed these jobs were the forgotten foundation of civilization, spending their lives in tedious labor that made possible the achievements and comforts that history remembers. They were the human machinery that kept ancient societies functioning, and their reward was obscurity, physical discomfort, and the knowledge that they would spend their entire working lives performing the same mind-numbing tasks that nobody else wanted to do. So the next time you're complaining about your job being boring, remember the ancient Egyptian tomb watcher, staring at the same stone door for months, wondering if the afterlife had better career opportunities. Remember the medieval leech collector, wading through disease-infested swamps to harvest slimy medical supplies. Remember the Roman wine tester, slowly poisoning himself one sip at a time to protect his social superiors from similar risks. These were the world's most boring jobs in history, performed by people whose names we'll never know, whose contributions we'll never fully appreciate, and whose mind-numbing daily routines made possible the civilizations we still study and admire today. But let's not forget the ancient Mesopotamian brick counter, whose job was exactly what it sounds like. In the cradle of civilization, where the first cities were built from millions of mud bricks, someone had to keep track of every single one, not just counting them, but recording their size, quality, and destination. You'd spend your days walking through brick, making facilities, tallying endless rows of identical clay rectangles, while scribes waited impatiently for your counts. The mathematics alone were mind-numbing. A single building project might require hundreds of thousands of bricks, and you had to track not just quantities, but also different sizes and qualities for different purposes. Foundation bricks were different from wall bricks, which were different from decorative bricks, which were different from repair bricks. Each category had to be counted separately and recorded in cuneiform script that took forever to write. The working conditions were spectacular in the worst possible way. Brick-making facilities were dusty, hot, and filled with the constant noise of workers shaping clay and firing kilns. You'd spend your days covered in brick dust, squinting in bright sunlight and breathing air thick with particles that left you coughing constantly. Your eyes would water, your throat would be permanently dry, and your clothes would be so embedded with dust that they'd never be clean again. Then there were the Viking ship timber inspectors, whose job was to examine every piece of wood used in longship construction. These weren't casual boats. They were sophisticated vessels that had to survive North Sea storms and carry warriors on raids across hostile waters. Every timber had to be perfect, which meant someone had to examine each piece of wood grain by grain. The inspection process was incredibly detailed. Each piece of timber had to be checked for knots, cracks, insect damage, rot, and structural integrity. You'd use primitive tools to test the wood's flexibility and strength, examining it from every angle to ensure it met the exacting standards required for vessels that warriors would trust with their lives. Oak was preferred, but not just any oak. It had to be the right age, cut at the right time of year, and seasoned properly. You'd work in shipyards that were cold, wet, and filled with the sound of axes and saws. The North Sea climate meant you'd be constantly damp and chilled, handling rough timber that left your hands covered in splinters and cuts. The work was seasonal and urgent. When raiding season approached, ships had to be ready, which meant working long hours in miserable conditions to ensure every piece of wood was acceptable. The pressure was enormous because structural failures at sea meant death for entire crews. A single piece of defective timber could cause a ship to break apart in heavy seas, sending dozens of warriors to the bottom of the ocean. This made your boring job a matter of life and death, but without any of the glory that came with actually sailing the ships you helped build. Let's return to ancient Rome and meet the professional aqueduct sediment remover. Roman aqueducts were engineering marvels that supplied cities with fresh water, but they required constant maintenance to prevent the buildup of mineral deposits and debris that could block water flow. Your job was to crawl through the underground sections of these aqueducts, scraping away accumulated sediment. The work environment was claustrophobic and dangerous. Aqueduct tunnels were narrow, dark, and filled with the sound of rushing water. You'd work by torchlight, crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body, using basic tools to scrape away mineral deposits that built up on the tunnel walls. The air was humid and stale, and the constant sound of water would echo until it became maddening. The physical demands were brutal. You'd spend hours crawling on hands and knees through rough stone tunnels, scraping away deposits that were often hard as rock. Your knees and hands would be constantly bruised and cut, your back would ache from working in cramped positions, and your lungs would be filled with dust from the scraping process. Plus, you'd be constantly wet from spray and humidity, which meant your clothes would never dry and your skin would be permanently wrinkled. But the real horror was the isolation. You'd work alone in these tunnels for hours at a time, with only the sound of water and your own scraping for company. The darkness was complete when your torch went out, and getting lost in the aqueduct system could mean death by drowning or simply never finding your way back to the surface. Now let's visit medieval Europe and meet the professional church bell oil applicator. Church bells required regular maintenance to prevent rust and ensure smooth operation, which meant someone had to climb up into bell towers and apply oil to all the moving parts. This was precision work that had to be done regularly regardless of weather conditions. The job required climbing to dangerous heights using primitive ladders and equipment. Bell towers were tall, windy, and structurally questionable, with narrow stairs and platforms that hadn't been designed with safety in mind. You'd carry heavy containers of oil up multiple flights of stairs, often in complete darkness, to reach the bells themselves. Once you reached the bells, the real work began. Each bell had multiple moving parts, pivots, bearings, and mounting hardware that had to be cleaned and oiled individually. This meant crawling around massive bronze bells suspended high above the ground, often while they were still swaying slightly from recent use. The oil had to be applied evenly and thoroughly, but not so much that it would drip onto people below during services. The working conditions varied from merely unpleasant to genuinely terrifying depending on the weather. In winter, you'd work in freezing conditions with wind whipping through the open bell tower, making every surface slippery and dangerous. In summer, the confined space would become unbearably hot, and the metal surfaces would burn your skin if you touched them carelessly. The timing made everything worse because bell maintenance had to be done when the bells weren't in use, which meant working at odd hours. You'd often find yourself climbing bell towers in the middle of the night or very early morning, working by lamplight in conditions that were already dangerous during daylight hours. Let's journey to ancient Japan and meet the professional rice paper quality assessor. In a culture that valued paper, making as an art form, someone had to examine each sheet of rice paper to ensure it met quality standards for different uses. This required incredible attention to detail and an eye for imperfections that most people would never notice. The examination process was exhaustive. Each sheet had to be checked for thickness variations, fiber alignment, surface texture, and color consistency. You'd hold sheets up to light sources to check for thin spots or holes, run your fingers across surfaces to detect irregularities, and compare each sheet to quality standards that were incredibly exacting. You'd work in rooms designed specifically for paper examination, with optimal lighting and minimal air movement to prevent papers from being damaged during assessment. This meant spending long hours in controlled environments that were sterile and silent, except for the sound of rustling paper. Your eyes would strain from the close inspection work, and your mind would go numb from examining hundreds of nearly identical sheets per day. The grading system was complex, with different quality levels for different uses. Paper intended for official documents had different requirements than paper for artistic purposes, which had different requirements than paper for everyday use. You had to remember all these different standards and apply them correctly to thousands of sheets. Knowing that mistakes would affect both the paper makers and the eventual users, the seasonal nature of rice paper production meant periods of intense activity followed by months of relative inactivity. During production season, you'd work extremely long hours examining enormous quantities of paper, while during off-season you'd spend time cleaning and organizing assessment tools and workspaces. Now let's travel to ancient Persia and meet the professional carpet knot inspector. Persian carpets were renowned for their quality and beauty, but achieving that reputation required someone to examine each carpet knot by knot to ensure consistency and quality. This was detail work that pushed the limits of human patience and eyesight. Each carpet contained thousands of individual knots, and every one had to be examined for tightness, alignment, and color accuracy. You'd work with magnifying tools, examining small sections of carpet at a time, looking for knots that were too loose, too tight, misaligned, or the wrong color. The patterns were often incredibly complex, which meant you had to understand the design well enough to spot deviations. The physical demands were significant. You'd spend hours bent over carpets, often on your hands and knees, examining tiny details with tools that required steady hands and perfect focus. Your back would ache, your eyes would strain, and your neck would be stiff from constantly looking down at your work. The close work in often poorly lit workshops would gradually damage your eyesight over years of employment. But the real challenge was maintaining focus while performing incredibly repetitive tasks. After examining thousands of knots, they all started to look the same, and it became increasingly difficult to spot the subtle variations that indicated quality problems. Yet accuracy was crucial because a single section of poor knots could ruin the appearance and value of an entire carpet. The pressure was intense because Persian carpets were often commissioned by wealthy patrons who expected perfection. A carpet that passed your inspection, but later revealed quality problems, would reflect badly not just on the weavers, but on you as the quality controller. This made every decision about accepting or rejecting knotwork a potential career-defining moment. Let's visit ancient India and meet the professional spice grain sorter. In a civilization where spices were more valuable than gold, someone had to sort through thousands of tiny seeds, pods, and dried plant materials to ensure quality and prevent contamination. This was microscopic work that required perfect eyesight and infinite patience. The sorting process involved examining individual spice particles, often smaller than rice grains, to identify different varieties and quality levels. Seeds had to be sorted by size, color, and condition, while dried spices had to be examined for mold, insect damage, and foreign matter. Each type of spice had different sorting criteria, and you had to remember dozens of different classification systems. You'd work in environments filled with aromatic spices that sounds pleasant until you realize the constant exposure would overwhelm your sense of smell and cause respiratory problems. Spice dust would get into everything: your lungs, your clothes, your food, and many spices were irritants that would cause sneezing, coughing, and watery eyes. Your hands would be permanently stained and dried out from handling various plant materials. The accuracy requirements were extreme because spice quality affected trade relationships across continents. Contaminated or misgraded spices could ruin diplomatic relationships, cause financial losses for merchants, and damage reputations that took decades to build. You were often the final quality control step, before spices were shipped to distant markets, making your boring job crucial to international commerce. The working conditions included temperature and humidity control requirements, because many spices were sensitive to environmental conditions. This meant working in spaces that might be uncomfortably hot or cold, depending on what was being sorted, while maintaining the concentration needed to distinguish between subtly different varieties of nearly identical-looking seeds. Let's return to medieval Europe and meet the professional manuscript ink quality tester. Before books could be written, someone had to ensure that the ink would flow properly, adhere correctly to parchment, and maintain its color over time. This meant testing batch after batch of ink, using systematic procedures that were both tedious and crucial. The testing process involved making sample marks with different types of writing instruments on various materials, then observing how the ink behaved. You'd test flow rates, absorption patterns, color consistency, and drying times under different conditions. Each batch of ink required multiple tests, and the results had to be carefully recorded for future reference. You'd work in rooms filled with the smell of various chemicals used in ink production: oak gall, iron, wine, and various other substances that were mixed to create writing ink. Many of these chemicals were toxic or irritating, so you'd constantly deal with headaches, nausea, and skin problems from exposure. Your hands would be permanently stained black from handling ink samples. The accuracy requirements were stringent because poor ink could ruin months of scribal work. Ink that faded, changed color, or failed to adhere properly could destroy valuable manuscripts, which represented enormous investments of time and materials. Monasteries and scribal workshops depended on your assessments to avoid costly failures. The testing had to account for different uses. Ink for everyday documents had different requirements than ink for illuminated manuscripts, which had different requirements than ink for legal documents that needed to remain legible for decades. You had to understand all these different applications and test accordingly. Finally, let's visit ancient Babylon and meet the professional cuneiform tablet inspector. In one of the world's first bureaucratic civilizations, someone had to examine the clay tablets used for record, keeping to ensure they were properly formed and would preserve information accurately. This was quality control work that affected the entire administrative system. Each tablet had to be examined for proper clay consistency, surface smoothness, and structural integrity. The clay had to be the right moisture content for accepting cuneiform impressions. The surface had to be smooth enough for clear writing, and the tablet had to be thick enough to avoid breaking, but not so thick as to waste material. You'd work in administrative centers surrounded by thousands of clay tablets in various stages of preparation and use. The air would be dusty from clay particles, and you'd spend your days handling damp clay that would leave your hands and clothes permanently dirty. The work required examining tablets individually while scribes waited impatiently to begin writing. The pressure was enormous because administrative records were crucial to civilization functioning. Tax records, legal documents, trade agreements, and property records all depended on tablets that could preserve information for years or decades. A tablet that cracked, crumbled, or failed to hold impressions clearly could cause legal disputes, financial losses, or administrative chaos. The quality standards were incredibly specific. Tablets had to be uniform in size for storage purposes, consistent in thickness for durability, and made from clay that had been properly prepared to avoid cracking as it dried. You had to reject tablets for flaws that were barely visible but could become major problems over time. These jobs, and countless others like them, formed the invisible foundation of human civilization. They were performed by people whose names history forgot, whose contributions went unrecognized, and whose daily experiences were defined by mind-numbing repetition and crushing boredom. Yet without them, the achievements we remember and celebrate would have been impossible. They deserve recognition, if only because they somehow managed to survive their work with enough sanity intact to show up the next day and do it all over again. They were the human machinery that made civilization possible, one boring day at a time.